You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. The 11th of February marks the anniversary of the ousting of the long-term leader Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. A popular uprising known as the Arab Spring began a few weeks beforehand, and the pressure of the street protests forced him to leave power. In 2011, it looked as if Egypt had entered a new democratic era. However, the 2013 coup against the elected President Mohamed Morsi soon shattered these hopes. The protests were led by a revolutionary youth council. But what was this movement and what happened to them? Joining us to answer this question is Rusha Latif. Rusha Latif is a researcher and writer based in San Francisco Bay Area. A first-generation Egyptian American, she traveled to Cairo in 2011 to conduct ethnographic research on the uprising. Her research included social movements and revolutions, the study of gender, class, race, and ethnicity, Islamic studies, and Middle East studies. She is the author of Tahrir's Youth, The Leaders of a Leaderless Revolution, American University Cairo Press, 2022. Rusha, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having us, man. I'm happy to be here.
And it is our pleasure to have you. I would like to sort of start, right at the beginning. So could you perhaps tell us or just sketch for us, why did you want to study activism in Egypt and Egyptian politics? I mean, obviously, it's when you sort of went in, this was obviously the high time for it. But what attracted you to it to begin with?
No, thank you for asking that. Honestly, my interest in Egyptian politics and Egyptian activism was sparked by the revolution itself. I would say that I probably wasn't even, super politically conscious at the time. It was really the event that kind of politicized me, kind of as a young person. But my interest in Egypt itself dates back much further, and as well as my connection. I'm Egyptian by heritage. My parents were born there and lived there. Then they moved here, of course, and I was born in the U.S. But I visited Egypt growing up. And I actually lived there for a good amount of time after I kind of completed my graduate studies in the early 2000s. For a number of years, I went to study Arabic and just reconnect with my heritage. And so it's actually funny because that was a time when things were getting really politically heated in Egypt. And I didn't kind of realize it until much later, but a lot of the events that I kind of cover in my book were happening all around me, but I just wasn't really, they weren't registering at the time. But I started to kind of recall those memories as I was working on the book. So even though I wasn't super politically kind of conscious, I was really developing my kind of social consciousness in Egypt at the time. Just through my kind of daily exposures to the kind of everyday inequities in Cairo, the sort of corruption everybody had to kind of deal with and any kind of basic transaction, and just the really dire socioeconomic circumstances Egyptians were forced to endure. So this actually kind of sparked my interest in social change. And I decided to return to the US after that to study development, just grad studies. And it was during my studies that I actually kind of discovered the theoretical literature on social movements and became really fascinated by it and kind of wanted to, dive in deeper. I was looking for a research topic, and then the revolution erupted right after that. It was really uncanny. It very much felt like I was being called to study that. And so not only was I really inspired by the kind of popular, show of people power, and just the heroism that we saw in those early days, but I was really struck by explanations for how this happened. I was trying to understand it for myself. And what grabbed my attention was sort of the media narrative, which was that this was a spontaneous, leaderless uprising. It was kind of driven by social media. We heard terms like Facebook revolution, which was kind of catchy and cool, for a lot of us at the time. And at the same time, there was this discussion of it being youth driven or youth led. And I remember kind of thinking about, well, like, how can it be leaderless and youth led? Which one was it? Could it be both? Like, there was this tension there that was really fascinating to me. And so I just decided, like, I really wanted to understand this for myself. So I kind of just took it up as my general research question, really just trying to understand what happened. And I really just wanted to be a part of the movement too. And that was kind of my excuse. So I went to Tahrir. I went to Egypt shortly thereafter in the summer of 2011. And sure enough, as I started to kind of begin my field work and network with activists in Tahrir, I was lucky in that when I arrived, there was huge protests. So like everybody was there for me to start networking with. I discovered that, this story of like leaderlessness and spontaneity was reductive. There was definitely, leadership happening. I mean, you could say that there wasn't leadership in terms of, the revolution might not have had this kind of charismatic figurehead, but that's not to say it was without leaders. There were definitely leaders, young people kind of in real time and space who were planning, strategizing, and trying to drive this movement. And in my mind, they deserve to be studied and kind of have their story told. So that's kind of what drew me in.
So, I mean, that's obviously what it got you interested in the politics of it. But obviously, as you mentioned, you're of Egyptian heritage, and I presume you'd obviously go to Egypt and you would connect, with the country. But if you could perhaps take us to the moment of 2011 itself, when these protests are happening, and you're sitting there watching it, just on give a sense for our audience, just on a visceral, personal level, what is it that's going through your head as this is happening?
While I'm in Tahrir kind of for the first time. Yeah, so I mean, I was really, I was obviously very captivated. I wanted to be a part of it. Watching it from afar, I really felt like this was my country and this is where I belong. I think as an American, an Arab American, anybody who sort of grows up in diaspora kind of struggles with these questions of belonging. And I certainly did, kind of growing up as an Egyptian American, a Muslim American, and kind of like the post 9/11 world. And suddenly, a lot of the kind of things that shaped our own kind of experience and marginalization here were like these images that were kind of coming out of the Middle East that people were kind of, these sort of that were kind of driving these kind of racialized images of us of being backwards or not into democracy. And suddenly there was this really inspiring, probably the most hopeful thing we had seen come out of the Middle East in our lifetime. And it was my own country. Kind of just taking down these myths one by one. It was really incredible to kind of experience that as somebody who grew up in diaspora. So I was like ready to go. And so when I get to Tahrir, I think one of the things that was sort of really powerful for me, and I talk about in my book, is that I kind of went thinking this was going to be really easy for me to do this research because I'm an Egyptian, I'm kind of an insider. And then I get there and I kind of realize I'm not as Egyptian as I thought. Having grown up in the US, I was sort of kind of detached from the experience of these people who were revolting. I couldn't fully identify with it, with their grievances, with kind of the history that was driving them. I had a lot of gaps kind of in my knowledge, right? So it was really humbling. So, part of the process for me was kind of getting in touch with that side of myself too, and trying to understand my story within this larger struggle. But sort of the visceral, um, just being in a revolution is a very kind of intense experience. It looks one way from afar, but when you're in it, kind of the chaos of it, the so many different players, the different directions it takes, and then trying to conduct research in that environment with kind of the leading activists was really intense, but a very rewarding experience.
It is, and I think one of the things about these sorts of protest movements and revolutions is
Yeah.
you find, for example, this sort of description, which is hard to understand if you have not lived it, which is the sense that your notion of time changes as you're in the protest. It's
Yeah.
the way you think about time. So before protests and before these revolutions, you think about time the way everyone else thinks about time.
Yeah.
It's about hours, minutes, seconds, and so on. And things happen over a long period. But in revolutions, it feels like every 10 minutes, time has changed again.
Yeah.
And there's a experience of time which is just very unique to it.
Absolutely.
Um, Yeah, that's just my sort of recollection. But also, it's kind of interesting what you're saying about this was the moment you chose to sort of go back to Egypt during this
Mhm.
time period, because there was actually, I think, from what I gather from a lot of friends of mine who are Egyptian who come from the UK and other places, there was a period of time where a lot of Egyptian diaspora went back to Egypt to live for a while. And some of them lived there for a few years and did things in Egypt and got married, did different things. And there was a kind of hopefulness about what this country was going to be, and a sense that we can find ourselves here again.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, it seems that that only lasted a few years and a lot of them left again.
Yeah, no, definitely. And even obviously many Egyptian activists themselves who who lived there their whole lives had to leave as well. Definitely there was that hopeful moment. I think a lot of people wanted to go back and be a part of it. And I think a lot of our parents' generation left because there was an opportunity or they didn't see it there. And so suddenly it felt like there was this opening where people could bring back like all that knowledge and skill and talent and kind of rebuild the country, and make it what once was, sort of that there's this kind of memory of Egypt being like Dunya, like the mother of the world. And so I think that that was definitely magnetic. It pulled a lot of us in. But obviously as things unfolded, it also pushed a lot of us back out. So that those are kind of tensions that a lot of us are thinking through today.
Yeah, it's a very bitter thing, and I mean it's obviously bitter for the diaspora went back, but it's even more bitter for the people who this was the only country they had or knew to
Yeah.
be thrown out again. But I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, we
We haven't
are.
even we haven't actually discussed the protesters yet. But before we sort of get to the 2011 point in 2011, I wonder if you could talk to me a bit about the history of Egypt in regards to protests, activism before
Yeah.
2011. I mean, obviously, you know, 2011, it's often described as an event,
Mhm.
and in some areas it was, but it's ignoring the fact that there was obviously precursors to all of this. You had the We
Yeah.
Are Khalid Said campaign, which was 2010, literally a year before, who was I forgot what he did, but he was killed by the police
And
in
Alexandria.
Alexandria, yes.
Yeah,
And that sparked an online protest and a protest movement in that place. Um,
absolutely.
but also there's decades of protests well before it. There's a whole history of protests in the sense. I'm wondering if you could take us through this a little bit.
Sure. So I think you're right to kind of point that out, because I think what that really illustrates, that sort of history, is is the problem with these tropes, the spontaneity tropes, this leaderless trope. Because especially when you put it now with like Facebook and social media and all of that, is that it gives the impression that this thing erupted in a vacuum, that it was kind of instant and online, and it sort of like inadvertently gives credit to like the Silicon Valley like tech bros, right? As if they're kind of the main drivers of the revolution, which is interesting for me as somebody who like lives very close to these places in the Silicon Valley. Um, so the truth is actually, as you mentioned, is that it's the culmination. The January 25th was the culmination of a resistance movement that was a decade in the making. It had been growing and intensifying in the streets for several years. And you see that history kind of play out in the lives of the activists who I end up profiling in my book. So if you were to ask any of these activists, when did the Egyptian revolution start? Immediately, they wouldn't tell you January 25th. They would date it back 10 years earlier to the year 2000, to the start of the Second Palestinian Intifada, in a moment very much like this one that we're in today. The activists, there was a lot of there was silence in the streets in that decade before because the Mubarak regime was really kind of like sort of hunting down sort of these kind of militant Islamist groups. And so that sort of meant sort of the death of street dissent for a while. But suddenly with Palestine, they sort of opened kind of the pressure valve in the way that they kind of had to do with most recent protests to sort of give people opportunity to let off steam. The regime didn't really see it as a problem because it wasn't really directed at them. But what happened was you had this new generation of these young people who came out and protested for the first time. And that became very quickly a gateway into dissent against the regime because they started to make connections like, wait a minute, this is happening on our border. Like, how is our government involved in this and sort of maintaining this order? And of course, along with the anti-Iraq war protests that followed, there was the huge global anti-Iraq movement, which Egyptians participated in. That becomes kind of together, those two events sort of form this first resistance movement wave around regional struggles. But then there's like these kind of three subsequent waves that build up on that. So the next one was basically a kind of a pro-democracy sort of movement. And that was the sort of what was the group that was championing that was known as the Kifaya movement. They were really kind of pushing back against this feeling that they were all getting, which was that, you know, Mubarak was going to try to hand down the presidency to his son Gamal. And so there was also like a judges kind of independence movement. There was also the elections in 2005, the first kind of what seemed to be a hopeful democratic presidential election. So some new kind of candidates were running that people were kind of building a movement around. So that's kind of that second wave. The third revolved around sort of socioeconomic reform and a huge labor kind of struggle and uprising. So workers across different sectors rose up demanding, you know, better wages and living conditions and things like that. And this was especially led by, you know, workers in the textile factory city of Mahalla. So that inspired new movements to kind of form, like the April 6th youth movement in solidarity with these workers. And then that fourth wave that you mentioned was the one around kind of police brutality. And that was sparked by the killing of the young man named Khalid Said in the city of Alexandria. And so that Facebook page you mentioned, We're All Khalid Said, which kind of became a very prominent platform for people to kind of organize through. It was born of that. So I'm kind of simplifying it a bit, but more or less, those are kind of the first, you know, there are four waves. And in the first two waves, you actually had this like kind of older generation of activists who were like leading and initiating this. And in the second two waves, you now actually had a younger generation who were kind of taking over, establishing the movement's leading them. And they were coming up with new protest kind of tactics and strategies. They were really kind of learning from the mistakes of their elders. One of their big frustrations with their elders was that they weren't making kind of these demands for change accessible to like the common people. They weren't kind of bringing in the general masses into the protests. Their approaches were still seen as kind of elitist. A lot of their protests were held like at downtown government buildings. So the activists were actively trying to think about how do we, you know, bring in the masses. And so one of the tactics, for instance, that they introduced was having flash protests in kind of these popular urban quarters, you know, on the periphery of Cairo. So we saw these kinds of like new things that they were introducing. And at the same time as they were doing this, you know, they're raising the culture of resistance in Egypt to new heights as they're kind of building this very robust activist network. It's loose, it's horizontal, it's decentralized, right? This movement structure. And in that sense, it's making a lot of space for these activists to kind of jump in and act autonomously and creatively and step up as leaders in their own way. So that's really kind of important to emphasize here, is that kind of horizontal movement structure, because it becomes the defining feature of this movement, and it carries over into the next and kind of plays out in a different way, which we can talk about. But the point is, like, as you mentioned, is that this resistance movement was brewing in the streets. It was young people who were kind of at its forefront at its later stages. And it was just kind of waiting for a trigger to like erupt into something bigger. And then of course that comes in the form of the Tunisian uprising, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yes, indeed, because obviously we have the Tunisian uprising, which happens, and then obviously Ben Ali flees power, and it's seen to be successful. Egypt follows on the 25th of January with, you know, it starts off as you know, it starts off with pages on social media called Days of Anger. We're organizing Days of Anger,
Yeah.
and it starts off, and I think most people have no idea who's going to attend, is this going to even work, what's going to happen, and to many people's surprise, in the protests,
Yeah.
it's like something had just gone off.
Right.
And it's during this formative period that we see the formation of different committees and groups within the protest camps.
Yeah.
And your book, which focuses heavily on the Revolutionary Youth Coalition,
Yes.
RYC, as I'll refer to them throughout this
I appreciate it.
interview. Could you perhaps tell us who are they, RYC? You know, who are they and how do they sort of form?
Sure. So, yeah, the group that I focus on my research is the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, RYC. In Arabic, it's Ittilaf Shabab al-Thawra. And I actually wasn't aware of this group before I went to Cairo. I knew of some of the groups under its umbrella, like April 6th. I learned about them basically when I was just sort of networking in those early days in Tahrir and trying to figure out who I should be speaking to for my research. And kind of my criteria was that I wanted to talk to people who could help me understand how the revolution erupted. Was there planning behind it, or was it really just spontaneous? And if so, who was involved? What were they doing? And so then I was directed eventually to this group, the RYC, and realized, okay, this is the group that I really need to focus on really quickly. So just to clarify, the RYC, like not all of the kind of revolutionaries who were part of the revolutionary camp were part of the RYC. The RYC was just kind of one unit within a larger kind of constellation of revolutionary actors who were trying to, who were behind the January 25th uprising, who were kind of driving it in the weeks and months that followed. But this group kind of stands out for a couple of reasons. And the first is that it's comprised of like the political youth groups that were most active on the ground in the lead up to January 25th. This was a very ideologically diverse set of groups. April 6th, which was kind of more liberal, leftist leaning. And then there was, you know, the Youth for Justice and Freedom movement. Some Muslim Brotherhood youth were part of that, more Islamists. So that's important. The next is that they had this like history of collaborating and coordinating mass actions together in the years before the revolt. So as I mentioned earlier, they're really kind of this group that plays this key role in building up the resistance movement in the streets against the regime. And in fact, on January 25th, like this was actually a day that they protested on every year, right? Because January 25th is Police Day. It's a national holiday in Egypt. You know, they regularly had these kind of annual protests on that day. And 2011 wasn't going to be any different. They had already like long started planning this protest. But what changes the game is Tunisia, right? It suddenly changes the kind of the mood and the vibe around, you know, what this day of protest could be. And it starts to spark their imagination. Like, what if we stepped up our game? What if we tried to strategize in new ways? Maybe we can have a similar kind of eruption. Maybe we can kind of initiate watershed protests that could be the start of like seeing really dramatic transformative change in the country. So that's what they do. This group gets together and they come up with this really brilliant, elaborate strategy for how to draw out a critical mass of protesters onto the street on January 25, starting with a group that doesn't normally protest, which are folks from like lower and working classes. And they don't normally protest out of fear of police, right? So the goal was to try to get them to overcome their fear of police. And the strategy was two-pronged. It involved kind of a ruse to distract the police. They announced on the Khaled Said Facebook page 20 protest locations across Cairo for the protesters to gather at. And then they came up with their own kind of secret 21st location where they decided they would mobilize a march that they hoped would, you know, that they tried to kind of snowball down Cairo's streets until they got to a square called Mustafa Mahmoud Square, which is in the district of Mohandesin. And the starting point would be one of these kind of impoverished neighborhoods. It would be a location nobody was expecting it, especially the police. And then it would kind of grow and connect to kind of this upper urban middle class area and just bring in like a diverse cross-section of Egyptian society. So that's what they did. They chose a location called Bulak al-Dakrur on the periphery of Cairo. And they executed their march. 250 of them showed up secretly in this location, started to call on folks, you know, just bystanders to join them in this area. And people start joining and the response like far surpasses their expectation. It's really amazing to kind of like hear them tell the story. And so they're just like kind of bewildered, like that they tapped into this incredible energy. And they get to, by the time they get to Mustafa Mahmoud, they're like, wait, this is like, the numbers are huge. We can do so much more with this. And now they realize they have the numbers that they could, you know, use to sort of achieve a larger dream, which was to conquer Tahrir Square. So in those moments, they had tentative ideas, maybe we could do it, but nobody ever thought they could get those numbers out in the streets that they need. So they quickly just kind of sketch this route and they start heading out to Tahrir. So they become this thick vein that kind of pours into Tahrir, bringing in this like mass. And there are other veins from these other kind of 20 protest locations that are seeping in because, activists are communicating over Twitter, like, what are we doing? And, the plan kind of forms sort of spontaneously. But what's different is that this group brings in the critical mass that sort of facilitates that game-changing siege of the square. So it's actually very possible that if that march didn't happen, we might not have an Egyptian revolution or possibly even an Arab Spring to speak about, because the revolution inspired kind of the waves of uprisings across the region after that. So that's why this group is really important. And as you can see, it kind of illustrates why this kind of leaderless and spontaneous narrative is problematic. It's because there clearly was planning behind it, right? There were people who were thinking about this. And yeah, it's just really important that that story is highlighted because, the question then becomes, well, then what happened after? Like, why weren't they able to continue to kind of build on this early success, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But that's kind of a key question that I ask in my book as well.
Yes, and we will certainly come to that question, but I do want to now ask about in those days, because
Yeah.
as you sort of mentioned, the council itself, obviously it's only one of many councils and committees that sort of form in the protest movement, but
Yeah.
it's quite diverse in terms of who it attracts, right? So you had people who were secular upper class youth, you had Muslim Brotherhood youth, you had different people from different ideological backgrounds.
Yeah.
So in the early days of these committees and, during the actual protest movement against Mubarak, how did they sort of navigate their sort of political differences?
Mhm. I mean, I think it was very early in those, it was easy in those early days because they had a very common, clear goal, which was they didn't want the system anymore. They didn't want Mubarak. And that was kind of really, I mean, they just had a very easy shared demand. Of course, going down on January 25th, that wasn't their goal. They weren't saying down with the regime. That wasn't even on their list of kind of chants, right? The chants that they went down with, especially to Bulak, had nothing to do with the regime. They were very actually intentional about not speaking about like Mubarak. They didn't want to freak people out, basically, and make them afraid of joining. So they concentrated, the chants that they chose reflected kind of the socioeconomic circumstances in Egypt, that, the bread prices are going up and things of that nature. There were some really quirky ones about like, stuff related about like the cost of furniture and things like that. But the point is they were trying to get people to just really tap into their socioeconomic frustration, poor education, for their kids, things like that. So those were very easy. They were also, they had their demands were basically they wanted to raise to like the minimum wage. I think they wanted 1,200 Egyptian pounds a month as sort of a minimum wage. They wanted the removal of Habib al-Adli, who was the head of the Minister of Interior of that time and was really hated just because he kind of oversaw this operation of like really repressing Egyptians. So they had some demands around that, around like the security sector and socioeconomic demands that were very easy to unite behind. But obviously when they kind of got to this common goal of like removing Mubarak, that's when kind of the fissures started to show up of like, well, what is our vision beyond this? And that's when kind of ideological differences kind of made its way into their discourse. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think just not having a general enough agenda that they could all get behind made it easy for them to work together in those early days, for sure.
Certainly, but obviously this also facilitated discussions about what the future ought to be. And of course, it's still in those days very vague, but there is a lot of discussion and debate happening, not just about tactics, about what to do here, but also about what do they want for the future? What do they hope for the future? So, I mean, it's also to think about the council as a facilitator of these kinds of discussions, right?
Yeah. So I don't know if I would call the council a facilitator. I think they're kind of a good group to sort of a window into the wider dynamics of the revolutionary camp, because I don't want to ever like reduce the revolution to this group or them as the main actors. They would refuse that themselves. But they're a good lens because they did kind of, they were deep in these discussions with other groups. So I think part of the challenge was the way that the revolution continued to unfold, because they didn't have this kind of clear vision from the beginning and the revolution was underway. They were kind of really torn as a movement in different directions. So there was never that time to kind of step back and like really think through like our differences and how do we kind of come around a common agenda, or what is it exactly that we want in concrete terms. And so naturally there was, you know, some kind of divisions erupted around like ideological lines. But just the being in the throes of the revolution, and that especially after Mubarak's removal, you know, I kind of mentioned to you, I highlighted this horizontal nature of the movement, was really something that was kind of working against them, because it made it really hard to kind of organize. This was a moment where they needed to maybe structure the movement more and consolidate and get a very clear on a vision to keep the masses engaged. And it was really hard to do that because they were consumed now in the battle with counter-revolutionary forces. So they were kind of in the situation where they had to figure out how to build the plane as they were flying it. And it was just really hard because they were just trying to block the moves and advances of their opponents, who were much more organized. So I think that was a big factor that lent itself to this challenge, not just the ideological differences, but just thinking about the wider dynamics of that period. There wasn't that space to kind of sit and deliberate and think and like work together around differences. So that's something that I try to kind of point out in my writing, is just the nature of that, the dynamics of that revolutionary environment and how that shaped the way it unfolded, and the movement's eventual defeat.
Yes, and before we get to the sort of 2013 moment, which is a
Yeah.
critical point, obviously before we have obviously Mubarak who leaves power in February 2011. Egypt then
Mhm.
goes through a transitionary phase, and then in 2012, Mohamed Morsi becomes president.
Yeah.
During this period between between the sort of leaving of Mubarak until the coup, so
Mhm.
before we get to the coup,
Okay.
how does what dynamics are playing out between these activists who are obviously involved, because obviously we're talking about a council, but these activists, it's made up of these activists who are in these councils who come from different backgrounds, and they're still communicating with each other. So what kind of dynamics sort of develops between them and their sort of vision for what's happening around them? How do they understand Morsi's election? How do they understand everything that's happening around them at that time?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things that are kind of happening that are working kind of against them at this point. So I mean, if we were just to maybe rewind a little bit further to like thinking about what happened in those remaining 18 days, because the Revolutionary Youth Coalition didn't form itself until 10 days into the uprising, when they would kind of announce them, when they did that amazing kind of protest march, they were still a loose network of youth movements. What kind of the question that they were dealing with from that point forward is uh, something dramatic was happening to them. And that's why I think having this kind of time-sensitive temporal kind of analysis is really important, is that their status was changing spontaneously, like on them. Like with the success of the uprising, a revolutionary situation was born unexpectedly in Egypt, and their status is now changing from activists to revolutionaries. And they're trying to wrap their heads around the moment, what this means, what they're supposed to do, right? And so a lot of them had dreamt of revolution, but nobody really knew, like, nobody actually ever really entertained the possibility seriously because of just Mubarak's grasp on, like, the political scene. Like there just wasn't nobody thought that a revolution would be possible in Egypt. So they just weren't really prepared when that moment came. So when it came, the question was, well, like, okay, what do we do now? How do we show up as leaders in this movement? What's our role? And this is a question now of revolutionary organizing. This is the same question that classical, like Marxist thinkers struggled with, which is, do you give leadership to these movements, or can the masses kind of pull it off on their own? And so eventually what the activists realized after 10 days of kind of trying to lead from behind the scenes, kind of facilitate the growth of this 18-day, this amazing camp that was budding in Tahrir Square, they realized that they had to provide leadership to the square because this whole thing was going to fall apart. And the trigger for that was an event called the Battle of the Camel, when Mubarak sent in a bunch of thugs to try to break up the protest square and attack protesters. And from there, there was a group called the Council of Wise Men. It was a group of old opposition figures that stepped into the fray and sort of positioned themselves as like the kind of wise group that was going to help bring an end to this impasse. So they negotiate with the regime, and that's when, you know, the activists become furious, and we're like, we need a voice that speaks on behalf of the radical position of the square so that it doesn't get co-opted or sold out. So that's when the Revolutionary Youth Coalition announces itself, and this is a very kind of hopeful moment. But even then, because the activists have to be really careful, because the movement itself doesn't like leaders. This is like one of the fascinating things about this movement. It kind of tears down anybody who puts themselves forward as the leaders of this, because what makes it legitimate, this movement, is that it's leaderless, right? It's seen as a mass people's movement. You know, and the activists themselves were like, do we even want that responsibility to say that we're the leaders? What does it mean to be the leaders of a revolution? And then obviously if they announce themselves, they're putting a target on their back. So there's all these really important dynamics to pay attention to, because it's not that the Egyptians, like these activists, didn't want to provide leadership, or kind of, it was these dynamics that were really hard to navigate and only revealed themselves within the context of this uprising. So eventually, you know, they try to come up with larger organizations, even with kind of the old opposition guard. There were tensions that surfaced because these old guard figures didn't really like the fact that these young people were suddenly taking the limelight in this political moment and upstaging them. So that, that kind of hindered efforts to create these larger vehicles. And also, I think this is really important to highlight here about this kind of horizontal phenomena, which is, you know, the kind of method the activists were really engaged in was trying to build consensus about the way forward. They were engaged in participatory democratic processes. That was their kind of praxis. And that wasn't really suitable for the urgency of the moment, right? If you have so many actors in the square, and if you're trying to build consensus, the problem is the regime is also kind of trying to make its moves and figure out how to contain this movement. So you have to move really quick, and that consensus building process was very time consuming. And so that was something that we saw over and over. And that's why eventually, you know, the military outmaneuvered the revolutionary camp and removed Mubarak and took over the kind of transition period from there. And then the Muslim Brotherhood pulls away, right? And so these dynamics now carry over into the transition period and become much more intense, because it's a battle now between kind of three larger groups: the SCAF, the military, the kind of the military camp, and then the Muslim Brotherhood and the revolutionary camp. And the revolutionaries were always just out organized and in this position of trying to figure out, at the same, they're trying to find the space to figure out a vision, but there just is no space to have these kinds of meetings and to deliberate, because of the sheer intensity and the fast-paced nature of the movement.
Indeed, it was a very intense period, but now we sort of get to you know, all of these dynamics are playing out,
Yeah.
and I imagine obviously things obviously do deteriorate, because of course, as Morsi comes in, you start to see greater and greater polarization between activists that were involved in these protest movements, especially, I mean, obviously there's general polarization in Egyptian society also taking place, and this is mirrored among the activists. So as we sort of get to 2013, we obviously have the coup that removes Morsi. We have obviously, and we have, you know, probably the most polarizing event, the Arabia Square massacre. And I'm sort of wondering now, in terms of, you know, the activists themselves, as we mentioned, you know, they come from different backgrounds and groups. How does, you know, how do they sort of divide themselves in terms of, you know, secular versus religious, class, political divisions? How did this play out in these revolutionary camps during that time period?
Yeah, sure. And I'm sorry, I feel like I didn't answer your previous question about, so by the, you know, obviously Morsi gets elected, as you mentioned. And that's, you know, that was kind of a function too of the disorganization of the revolutionary camp, because they couldn't get organized enough to field one candidate in the kind of, you know, election runoffs. And so they had two candidates that kind of represented the revolutionaries. and they split up the vote, right? And so that's why in the end we ended up with Mohamed Morsi versus Ahmed Shafiq. And a lot of the activists weren't really happy about this choice, but they threw their votes behind Morsi as a measure of trying to avoid the election of an old regime candidate, Ahmed Shafiq. So what happens, it's important to highlight, by this point, so shortly after 2012, the RYC itself dissolves as a group, and what they say kind of in their press release or their is that this was now, with the election of Morsi and kind of, we're kind of the beginning of trying to build democracy in the country. This necessitated like a new organizational forms from the youth, that this coalition wasn't really serving them anymore, the movement. So they all wanted to kind of go in different directions, maybe build some political parties or work on other initiatives. So they disband, but in truth, they disband also because they're struggling at this point as a group. There's a lot of kind of internal and external challenges, including the fact that one, they're losing their connection to the street. They just end up spending a lot of time talking to the media, becoming kind of media pundits instead of doing that kind of grassroots organizing. They're also becoming very obscured kind of in this a political scene. One of the tricks that the military pulls off is they start to introduce a lot of youth coalition type groups. And so they just kind of become sort of obscured in this scene. And then there's obviously like the ideological rifts that you're talking about, which were happening in the larger camp. And sadly, this group was actually really important because they showed in the beginning that people could organize across ideological differences for the interests of the country. But in this moment where, in this upheaval, and it became very hard to kind of maintain that cohesion across ideological lines. So they disband. And, eventually we have, this new uprising that starts to build up against Mohamed Morsi. And we can think about the coup and the impact, all of these events, how they, impact the activists now as former members of the Revolutionary Coalition, and how that kind of reflects the rifts across kind of the revolutionaries in the kind of wider camp. So I think that's illustrated best in two activists who I kind of profile in the book, one named Abdurrahman and one named Tariq, who were comrades in the beginning of the revolution. One, Abdurrahman was more maybe left-leaning, kind of identified as an independent, and Tariq was more liberal-leaning. You mentioned kind of this question of like religion and secular divides. I think, it's hard to kind of talk about those events strictly along kind of religious secular lines, because secular is a very murky term in Egyptian political discourse. A lot of the people that kind of were upset with Morsi and kind of rebelled against him would identify as religious, even though they might not be Islamist. So that said, so we, the term liberal or secular is kind of a catch-all phrase for kind of anybody who is against Morsi or the Muslim Brotherhood in general. And definitely, I think to some extent, there were some class undertones in that kind of contempt, religiosity, especially when it like, in the way it's sometimes associated with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood is kind of identified with like kind of a low class thing. And so we definitely kind of saw that, especially among kind of the upper class Egyptians who identified as this kind of liberal group that was rising up against Morsi. And that was very clearly a feature in the discourse. And also, we saw Islamophobic kind of motifs being mobilized to marginalize the Muslim Brotherhood, to kind of talk about them as a fifth column and with allegiances with international Islamist groups, instead of like, to their country, things like that, which, as a larger discussion, some of those claims, a lot of unsubstantiated claims were kind of thrown into the mix in that discourse. But the point is, if you look at like Abdurrahman and Tariq, Abdurrahman actually came from a Muslim Brotherhood family, even though at a very early age he didn't identify with that group. These two young men were kind of on similar tracks. They were comrades in the early days. They take different kind of paths with respect to Morsi's election. one, votes for him as a measure of like avoiding the lesser of two evils. The other one refuses to vote at all.
After this interview was done, Rusha Latif contacted me and pointed out that she actually misspoke in this section, and Abdul Rahman was not referring to Mohammed Morsi as the lesser of two evils that he would vote for, but in fact was talking about a rival to Morsi in that election, Ahmed Shafiq, as being the lesser of two evils and that he would vote for.
They were both really frustrated with the way Morsi was governing, so they kind of voiced that in very similar ways. And then as this tension was building up, they both supported kind of like the June 30th protests, but in different ways. Tariq was a lot more invested in this kind of Tamarrud movement, which was the petition campaign to remove him from power. Abdurrahman was more weary because he started to feel like the military was going to get involved, which Tariq actually endorsed. He was really fully behind the military getting involved. And then you can kind of see where this is going by the time we actually have the day of protests. After that, there's like, this coup and this massacre that happens. Tariq is for the coup, Abdurrahman isn't. And then it's what do you do about these supporters that are occupying these, Morsi supporters that are occupying these squares. And they had this open-ended sit-in for several weeks. Initially, both of these young men supported the right of the protesters to continue to protest. But eventually Tariq, as the kind of, there was this anti-Morsi kind of anti-brotherhood buildup that was happening in the media. And there was all these claims about weapons in the square and things like that. He started to endorse the forceful and violent kind of removal of the protesters from the square, which was very shocking, especially as a liberal, to see that kind of transformation in him. The idea is that you're supposed to sort of, liberalism is supposed to be kind of about inclusion, about, everybody having a voice and stuff. And Tariq was going beyond just like wanting to marginalize his ideological opponents to actually kind of endorsing this really terrible act that happened in the square. And he was very vocal about it in the media. And what ends up happening to Abdurrahman is that one of his brothers is actually killed in the Rabaa protests. So I think that's just really generally reflective of what happens to the revolutionaries. And I think the best what captures that best is where they're at today. So Abdurrahman is living in exile. He fled immediately after 2013 to avoid certain arrests, like many of his family members and friends. He fled to Qatar, took his wife and daughter, and eventually moved to London, where he is today. And Tariq ended up being an avid supporter of the regime. He's now a member of parliament in Egypt, doing very, very well for himself. So he kind of squarely fits in that camp. His friends call him a sellout. He doesn't think he's a sellout. He thinks that he's pushing the revolution, the demands and the goals of the revolution from the inside, right? And I think all of this is just really symbolic of, what happens when you don't actually structure your revolutionary movement. When you don't kind of have that cohesion, clearly set those boundaries, what the agenda is for the movement, it becomes very easy for people to kind of lose track and fall off and take different paths and lose their way. And I think we saw some of that happen with the Egyptian revolutionaries. I think that these divisions and rifts were symptomatic of that. So I think those dynamics are really important to highlight and just think about for even any other kind of revolutionary movement struggle is the importance of thinking about structure, thinking about how to bound the movement, and prevent people from speaking on behalf of it that don't really represent its interests.
Yes, and because obviously you mentioned too, but many of the activists, obviously many did also leave, others left, and obviously others stayed. And so from the council, former members of the council, where did this sort of, because you profiled quite a few different people in there so what happened to the others aside from the two you just mentioned?
Yeah, so in my book, I profiled 10 activists from the Revolutionary Youth Coalition. These were members of the executive committee, and as I mentioned, they represented the different movements and kind of ideological currents of the coalition. So several of them ended up in exile, like Abdurrahman, and they're in different countries like Qatar or Turkey. Different parts of Berlin is a really big location for Egyptian exiles, London, and in the US, especially like New York, DC, there's a lot of young people who went to kind of work for policy type organizations to advocate for, better conditions in Egypt, economic, political, things like that. And some went to grad school in all of these different countries. You have obviously several that are in prison. One of the activists that I profiled in my book is still in prison, Mohammed al-Qassas. He was formerly a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but had left shortly after the start of the revolution. But he was kind of still seen as one of those figures. So he got unfortunately swept up in the arrests of kind of Islamists after the coup. And several others who I didn't profile in my book are with him in jail. And then the rest are kind of just living in Egypt and sort of laying low below the political radar. And yet, that revolutionary fervor hasn't really died out in Egypt. It's still kind of there, boiling under the surface. And I think we're seeing it most acutely right now with what's happening with Gaza. For the first time we saw, like since 2013, protesters break into Tahrir Square and chanting bread, freedom, and social justice as a nod to like that this revolutionary chant was still very much alive in their hearts. And really staging some daring protests against the regime in light of their position on Gaza and like not opening the border on the Rafah. So it almost feels like there's this circular moment. It's kind of coming back to like in the way that, we're seeing a whole new generation of youth activists kind of come into this moment across the region and especially in Egypt. But, they're still kind of being very careful and laying low and strategic about how they protest.
So that sort of gives us also a snapshot into where we are today with the activism. But I'm now wondering, of course, we're now obviously in 2024, what is the legacy of the 2011 revolution?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, its legacy is huge, I think. I mean, one, just on the level of like, that the activists actually, what they did and kind of sparking this protest and this kind of mass movement should never be belittled or underestimated, even though it wasn't successful in the end, in the short term. It doesn't mean that's not still achievable in the long term. We know that revolutions are long processes that take decades to unfold, and they unfold in cycles. There's ups and downs. So, we're in a moment of defeat for sure. The activists will be the first to say that. But what they did was introduce the possibility of dramatic change in their country. They introduced this, Egyptians have this memory now of people power that's really potent and powerful that they're able to tap into in moments like this. And the issue right now in Egypt isn't just, what's happening in Palestine, it's also just socioeconomically, inflation is like on the steep rise. People are like really suffering. Conditions haven't changed since 2011. The conditions that gave rise to the uprising, they've only gotten much, much, much worse on all fronts, political, socioeconomic, regional in terms of foreign policy. So that memory is always there. What the activists also gave, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, was kind of this image of like, they've corrected the image of Arabs for themselves, their sense of, dignity and, the way they kind of see themselves and their role in the world and what they can do, but also for the public, and especially Western publics that were kind of fed these images of, Arabs being backwards and barbaric and anti-democratic, right? These images are fed to these publics to keep them kind of invested in these policies that suppress, that enable kind of the US to maintain their dominance in the region, right? And so that was a huge impact too, is just putting out those images that undermine these narratives about Arabs. But I think most importantly, the gift that Egyptian revolutionaries have given us, especially in this time of when, everybody's trying to figure out how do you carry out sweeping, transformative, revolutionary change. Like there's been so many attempts, not just in the Egyptian revolution, but the wave of uprisings across the region and even around the world. Egypt sparked this wave that that took on different forms in different countries. And the gift that they kind of gave us in trying to remake their country and that experience is that they showed us like the limits of existing theories about how to carry out a revolution. there isn't really a theory or clear ideation around how do you actually do that in the 21st century when power dynamics are so much more complicated. They're not just concentrated in the kind of leadership and ruling elite of the country, but in this larger global web of power, right? That's one level. How do you kind of organize across deep differences, right? And maintain that solidarity until you achieve a common goal. There's so many questions that the Egyptian revolution raises, and really in giving us this experiment and handing over, like, here's what we tried to do, now study it and learn from it. They gave us this really rich case study to kind of start figuring out maybe answers to those questions. And I think that's really like an important and valuable contribution to just the world. So the literature that's coming out is really inspiring, especially from the Egyptian Revolution and the Arab uprising in general. I think they gave us kind of, really solid empirical like case studies to work with to start theorizing and imagining new ways forwards for revolutionary struggle. So I think that's probably the greatest gift and the greatest legacy that I think we'll continue to see sort of develop in the years to come.
Rusha Latif, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you would like to catch up with this one or previous episodes of MEMO Conversation, you can go to our website. But until then, please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.